So welcome everyone to Fiscal Sponsorship 101. I am Caitlin Seifritz, the Nonprofit Services Supervisor at the Regional Foundation Center. Welcome to today's program. Before we get started and before I introduce our presenter, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Regional Foundation Center for anyone who is joining us for the first time. We are a nonprofit resource center at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and we have been serving Philly's nonprofit community since 1974. And we do that by providing access to high quality research databases, one-on-one research appointments with librarians, and free programs and workshops for nonprofit professionals. Due to COVID-19, our space is physically closed, so we have moved all of our programs and services online, but we remain committed to your professional development. So once I'm done talking, I'll drop a link in the chat box to our website. So feel free to learn more about our programs or services and check out our online databases like Foundation Directory Online Essential. I also wanted to highlight our upcoming grant writing series, which starts a week from today on May 4th. The grant writing series is a 3-part series, which includes Introduction to Finding Grants, Introduction to Proposal Writing, and Intermediate Grant Writing. All those classes are free, and we welcome anyone who's either new to the grant seeking process or wants to brush up on their skills to join us as we take a deep dive into finding grants and writing grant proposals. So you can find information about all of those sessions on our website, again, which I'll drop a link to in the chat. So a few logistics for today. We are recording today's session, and I will be sending out the recording within 48 hours. We'll also include the slides as well. And if any resources get shared in the chat, I'll make sure you get links to those as well. So we're hoping today will be kind of conversational. We know a lot of you have brought questions with you. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. You can also unmute yourself to ask questions as well. At the end of today's workshop, I will be putting a link to a program evaluation. We would love to hear your feedback on today's workshop, as well as any other suggestions on workshops you'd like to see the Regional Foundation Center present. So with all that being said, I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today's workshop. Tavani DeVore is the Director of Growth and Engagement at the Urban Affairs Coalition, and he will be leading today's workshop. So I will turn things over to him.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Caitlin. And thanks for coming to Fiscal Sponsorship 101 conversation. What I'm going to do today is kind of just talk about the concept of fiscal sponsorship, the models of fiscal sponsorship, how to shop for it, and things like that. But feel free to, if you have questions that pop up, you can feel free to add them into the chat or raise your hand, or if we have a smallish crowd, we can just kind of call them out if need be. And we'll make sure we'll try to answer everyone's questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start walking through Fiscal Sponsorship 101. So like I said before, we're going to talk about what it is, how it's used, who provides it, and then we'll do Q&A throughout and at the end as well. So fiscal sponsorship, what it really is simply the practice of one nonprofit organization with its 501c3 status offering that legal status umbrella coverage to an individual or another organization or even a business or anyone really. There's no special rules from the IRS or the law around fiscal sponsorship. There's no special regulations around fiscal sponsorship per se. So any nonprofit with 501c3 status can provide fiscal sponsorship to anyone or any organization they want. Usually that is done, there's two types of fiscal sponsorship really around how it gets provided. There's what I call professional fiscal sponsorship, which are nonprofits like the Urban Affairs Coalition and others that provide it at a professional level. They provide a core set of services. They have agreements. They're really built to provide that service. There's also what I would call casual fiscal sponsorship, which is really, you might have a friend or know somebody that has a 501c3 status, and they want to just give you some coverage so you can do a project. So like my local schools Friends of organization is casually fiscal sponsored by a local neighborhood nonprofit. It's like a handshake. There's not a contract. There's no fees. It's just like raise a little bit of money, spend a little bit of money, no big deal. But also, when you're talking about professional fiscal sponsorship and when you're bringing your organization or your vision to another nonprofit, you want to make sure that you have a contractual agreement with a scope of services, and usually there's some fees involved in that. The fees really range anywhere from 5 to as much as 20%, depending on the type of fiscal sponsorship, the services that are provided, etc. But as I was saying before, anyone can provide it to anyone else. So some nonprofits will do a little bit of fiscal sponsorship to try to earn some revenue on the side. Some decide to go full bore into it and do it as their main service. There's lots of different ways to use it and how it gets used. So if you're doing a short-term project, if you're doing a fundraiser or a cleanup or something like that, where you don't really need a year-round organization, you can use fiscal sponsorship to kind of jump in and jump out as your projects start and finish. If you're a startup and you want to get going fast, it's usually faster to find a fiscal sponsor than it is to go through the formal process of getting the 501c3 status from the IRS, etc. If you're a for-profit and you want to do nonprofit activities, it's always good and easier to use a fiscal sponsor. Oftentimes that makes sure that there's a good legal firewall between what the for-profit is doing and what the nonprofit is doing, because you don't want to get into like self-dealing trouble or anything along that when you have two organizations working together. Sometimes established 501c3s will reach out and want fiscal sponsorship. They might look for ways to reduce their costs around their overhead. And then also if they're in distress, if they've lost a funder, sometimes when an executive director retires, it's hard for the nonprofit to recover from that immediately. Sometimes there's a funder issue or another problem. So an established organization will join a fiscal sponsor maybe for a year or two, just to kind of get back on its feet, reorganize itself, and then spin back out. Sometimes they stay. Also funders, so if a funder wants to do a project, either a foundation or a government funder, and they want to do a type of project or a pilot, but doesn't happen to be an organization that feels like a good fit for them to use, they'll use a fiscal sponsor to test out an idea around that. We question, would an established 501c3 need to formally forfeit their status to the IRS before accepting sponsorship? So no, they don't have to. Fiscal sponsorship of existing nonprofits happens for different reasons. You can keep your 501c3 status, quote unquote, on the shelf and move everything over to the fiscal sponsor. Some 501c3s, if they have assets, if they have buildings, if they have stock holdings or something like that, they might want to keep their own 501c3 status to manage that asset, but do their operations, do their programming, have their staff on the nonprofits, on the fiscal sponsor side, and then have like a lease agreement or a rental agreement between the two to still use that space. So there's different strategies, but there's no reason or no rationale why a fiscal sponsor would force a nonprofit to give up its 501c3 or make it retire it. And there's 6 real major forms of fiscal sponsorship. There's a direct project, which is the most common kind of comprehensive model of fiscal sponsorship, where an organization or individual comes all the way under a fiscal sponsor and becomes like a project or program, legally speaking, of the fiscal sponsor. It's comprehensive. There's an independent contractor project and pre-approved grant relationship. These are very similar. A lot of artists will use these. If an artist is trying to get a grant to do a project, but the foundation needs to give the grant to a nonprofit and not an individual, that individual or independent contractor will use a relationship with the fiscal sponsor to manage that grant. So CultureWorks in Philadelphia does that. Fractured Atlas, which is national arts program, does that. They have thousands of people using their thousands of artists using their platform for fiscal sponsorship. Group exemption is a model around like you're having chapters. So that could be Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, sororities, etc., where you have one national organization and many different chapters around the country. So not every chapter needs to have their own 501c3 status. There's a group exemption model for that. A supporting organization, sometimes this is used, it's more rare, but it's kind of used for international work. So if you're fundraising for work in America, but the work is happening outside the United States, a supporting organization attach the dollar, the tax receipts, etc., make it tax deductible, and then move the money or move the supplies, the resources to the international work. And then technical assistance is simply technical assistance. It's providing professional development, support, consulting, etc., that fiscal sponsors can share their knowledge and information with organizations who are looking for some support or ideas. These are the services that are mostly provided by most fiscal sponsors. Everyone's different, but these are the ones that you should expect and ask for if you're looking at fiscal sponsorship. Bookkeeping and accounting. So the fiscal sponsor is really ultimately responsible for the money you raised in their name. So they would be providing most of the bookkeeping and accounting for you because they're responsible for the management of those dollars. HR and benefits management. So if you have staff, full-time or part-time, your staff are technically staff of the fiscal sponsor from a legal perspective. So they should be providing you with all the HR and benefits management needs, healthcare, vision, dental, etc., through the fiscal sponsor. Tax and insurance compliance. So your project or program would be a part of your taxes and insurance would be part of the 990. It would be part of the directors and officers insurance, etc. So you'd be covered for tax and insurance compliance that way. Program support and professional development. So fiscal sponsors should be providing you some level of like in-house coaching, consulting, support about what you're doing, how you're doing it. Maybe provide introductions to people, provide more workshops like this one, and things like that. Quick question about pre-approved relationships. Sure. So a pre-approved relationship, a grant relationship, is where an individual or organization does not have 501c3 status, wants to go after a grant. A fiscal sponsor can say, I will fiscally sponsor you if you win this grant. If you don't win the grant, no big deal. We don't have to have an agreement. We don't have to pay any fees. But if you do win the grant, we will fiscally sponsor you for that grant as kind of a one-off. Sometimes after having that first one-off, it spurs more grants and more opportunities, and it becomes a full-fledged program. But that's really around getting pre-approval to go after dollars for the first time. Just checking the questions. So this question here is, we need a sponsor to manage the financial back office of our initiative as we collect major corporate and foundation funds. What is needed for a funding agreement? So I'll bring that up near the end around the agreement level stuff. So the risk of fiscal sponsorship, these are some of the risks that people are concerned about. This is kind of separates professional fiscal sponsors from casual fiscal sponsors. Is the level of control that fiscal sponsor will lay out. So the fiscal sponsor is legally responsible for what's going on in your organization. Most fiscal sponsors give you a lot of autonomy in what you do and how you do it. They just want to make sure that you're following the rules of the money you raise and the rules of the IRS and the law and the municipality you're in. Some fiscal sponsors, depending on how they want to handle that control, might have more direct oversight. They might make you put their logo on things, etc. So these are the things you want to look at when you're talking to a fiscal sponsor. Sometimes funders aren't familiar with fiscal sponsorship. So if you're going after grant dollars, the foundation or funder might not know about fiscal sponsorship, or might not be set up in their application to talk about fiscal sponsorship or ask about fiscal sponsorship. If that happens, you should reach out to your fiscal sponsor, and they should be able to have a conversation with the funder and talk them through and deal with that. Luckily, in the Philadelphia region, there's enough fiscal sponsors that have been around long enough that most funders in the area are very familiar with fiscal sponsorship and how to go about it and how to do it and manage that. Control of intellectual property. So the fiscal sponsor, as the legal entity, also legally owns the intellectual property that's done under its umbrella. So a fiscal sponsor might hold for you copyright information, copyright rights, trademark rights, patent rights, etc. If you're very uncomfortable with that, you want to make sure it's written well into your agreement how that works. Or you can have your intellectual property on your own independent 501c3 or own LLC and quote unquote license it or allow the nonprofit fiscal sponsored group to use it. But the ownership of the intellectual property stays outside the fiscal sponsor. So if you're writing a book or building an app or you have something that you feel has very big intellectual property value, you want to make sure you're managing that correctly and covered how you want to be covered. And then financial instability of the fiscal sponsors. So there have been fiscal sponsors in the past that have kind of gone out of business or have had bad management of funds. So when you're choosing a fiscal sponsor, you're choosing someone that you have to trust with your money, the money you raise. And so you want to make sure that they know what they're doing, that they have cash reserves, that they're built and set up to make sure that that does not happen. My organization has been around 50 years. We're not going anywhere, but some organizations, things happen and you have to make sure that you're keeping track of those dollars, you're paying attention, and you trust the people you're working with. So where can you find a fiscal sponsor? So there's a fiscal sponsorship directory, which is a great place to find, it's a directory of fiscal sponsors all across the country, state by state. There's the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. The National Network of Fiscal Sponsors is a group of fiscal sponsoring organizations who do it professionally, who meet a few times a year and talk about how the industry works, best practices, training, etc. And so the members of the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors are ones that are following best practices, that are working with their peers around the country and doing that kind of good work. And then, like I said before, any 501c3 with a similar mission, can provide your fiscal sponsorship. You can reach out if you know somebody that has 501c3 status, and it's a mission fit, so that they don't have to worry about mission drift on their 990. They can provide fiscal sponsorship for you. Here are a few Philly area professional fiscal sponsors. So, of course, the Urban Affairs Coalition, the operation that I work at. CultureWorks Philadelphia. CultureWorks Philadelphia is mostly focused on arts and culture programs and independent and mostly individual artists and a few organizations. Public Health Management Corporation, or PHMC, is a large fiscal sponsor. They take on full systems. They're looking for probably organizations that are, $500,000 or up, and mostly in the healthcare field. There's FNC Philly, which is a newish fiscal sponsor in Philadelphia. They take on grassroots organizations, community organizations, and things like that. So that's a good one to look at. And then IOB.com is new. In our backyard is what that means. And IOB.com is a crowdfunding website that can also provide fiscal sponsorship. So think of GoFundMe plus fiscal sponsorship. So you get it all in one package. They have, I believe they have a lower admin fee because it's online. It's pretty straightforward. So those are a good set of places to find fiscal sponsors in Philadelphia. And then I'm gonna talk about a little bit of the shopping. I'll take another look at the chat for questions. But when you're shopping for fiscal sponsorship, and which is something that you can do in Philadelphia, you want to look at what are the fees and costs, right? So are there startup fees, are there annual fees, are there minimal fees? Most fiscal sponsors charge an admin fee, which is a percentage of the dollars you raise, and they have to manage on your behalf. They range between 5 and 15%. Admin fees, most charge between 10 and 12% for what they're providing. And they're providing And that 10 to 12% really covers all the stuff that we talked about, the administrative management, the bookkeeping, accounting, HR, et cetera. And you want to look at the services you're providing for that. So not all fiscal sponsors have the same level of HR benefits, have the same level of accounting support. What kind of technology are you using these days? Do you have to like physically go to an office to talk to an accountant? Are they more remote? Are they online? These are the kind of things you should ask. What's the kind of customer service can you expect? Are you going to get a monthly balance statement? How easy is it for you to track your money? How fast is it to get a response from your accountant or from the organization? Those are the things you want to understand. Who will be assigned to my organization by the fiscal sponsor? And this is talking about, do you have an accountant, an HR person, a program support person? Who are these people? How well do they know what they're doing? How often will you see them? Do they know really about your mission and your work? Can they provide some extra support? And how long is the time commitment? So is it a 1-year agreement? Is it a 5-year agreement? Does it renew automatically? These are all things you want to ask up front and kind of negotiate when you're talking about fiscal sponsorship. And then quickly, if you have when you're applying for fiscal sponsorship, these are the kind of things that you want to provide to pitch yourself in the best way forward. You really want to have a unique idea that will excite the sponsor and aligns with your mission. So if you have an arts and culture program and you come to UAC, we might recommend, hey, check out CultureWorks. It might be a better fit for you. They have a better network and they're better mission alignment. But really having a solid business plan that covers what you want to do, how you're going to do it, why are you qualified to run this organization? Like you have an idea to start a nonprofit, why should you be the executive director of it? What it will cost, like what is your budget and how will you design your budget? And how are you going to pay for that? So if you come to a fiscal sponsor with this $1 million budget and you're going to pay yourself $100,000, but your fundraising strategy is going to the Regional Foundation Center and looking into a grant database, it might be hard to think that will be achievable. So you want to have a fundraising plan and a budget that align. So you're raising what you need to raise to do what you want to do, and you're not going to run out of money or fail to raise enough money to actually do the work you're going to do. And then do you have any funders or committed or pledged to your project? So if you're coming in with funding, usually fiscal sponsors will want to work with you faster because they want to help you get that money. If you're, as opposed to, I need to get my 501c3 status from you, and then I have to go around and figure out how to raise the money. This is a longer runway. So you can talk to funders, you can talk to grant makers, you can talk to donors, and get soft commitments from them. Kind of say, hey, I've got this money kind of lined up. I need a place for it to go. I need you to help me manage, catch these dollars and manage these dollars. All right, this is we're going to question and answer time, and I will go through the chat real quick. So what do we need? Just a fund agreement? What's the legal hurdles we must address to raise the funding? So you would need a fiscal sponsorship agreement or memo of understanding that kind of outlines what you're going to get from the fiscal sponsor and what you're going to pay for that. So this could be anything from a handshake around casual fiscal sponsorship, as I talked about, to a couple-page memo deal, to like a 15-page legal document. But in that, you want to outline your expectations of what you're going to get for what you're going to pay for and how much you're going to pay for it. And so those are it's really just a scope of service contract that you're going for. When you're going to funders and saying, hey, I'm fiscally sponsored, they'll ask for proof, and that proof would be normally a letter from the fiscal sponsor affirming that you're approved. The funder might ask for the actual fiscal sponsorship agreement, which you'll get, you'll have a copy of. And those are the main ones. If the funder will ask for 3 years of audited financials or 990s, the fiscal sponsor will provide those because it's their information, and the termination letters, et cetera. And then you'll be able to catch those dollars. Your organization, your budget will be the program description, and the fiscal sponsor will be the organization description, as usually is outlined in the grant applications. When you're talking, so here's another question. Our fiscal current sponsor has limited capacity, has too much limited capacity to help us grow. So sometimes groups will outgrow their fiscal sponsor, and they can either find another fiscal sponsor. We've sometimes taken groups from a different fiscal sponsor to ours. So it's just a matter of understanding the agreement that you're in, understanding how you can exit out of that agreement, and what that takes. So usually that should be in your agreement that you sign up for, is like how to exit your agreement before you sign up for it. Another question is around boards. So with a fiscal sponsor, do you need to recruit a board or just have a project and fund? So you don't need a board per se, like a board of governance. The legal board of governance will be the fiscal sponsors board. What you're doing is, what fiscal sponsors normally do is encourage you to have a advisory board. Your advisory board works functionally the same as a governance board. They provide oversight, they provide encouragement, they provide dollars, they provide networking. They're not legally responsible, they're not on the 999 or anything like that. But if you need one or not is really up to your fiscal sponsor. So they'll put that into the requirements. It's encouraged to have anyway, because you need all the help you can get. But if it's really up to them if you need one or not. Okay, the next question, 10 to 12% of what? So yes, it's generally total dollars raised. So your gross revenue. So if you raise $100,000, 10% of that, 12% of that will go to in admin fees to the fiscal sponsor. If you're writing a grant and you have to supply a grant budget, you normally include the admin fees into the budget as indirect rate or admin or overhead or staff time, depending on how they make you write it up. But your fiscal sponsor will make sure that the dollars you need to pay them are built into the grants that they're raising for you. Intellectual property. So when you leave their sponsorship, you take it with you. Yes. So both things are correct, that you should be able to take it with you, and you should have that address in your contract. So our contracts have a clause around intellectual property. Whatever you make, you take it with you and you go with it. Sometimes if we're working closely with an organization and we're helping them develop something that has intellectual property potential, we'll create like a side agreement and an addendum to the original agreement around that. But in my time, that's never had to happen. But usually if an organization or individual is concerned about that, they will hold the intellectual property in an independent legal entity, either in their own name, an LLC, or their own nonprofit. But it should definitely be in the MOU agreement, that conversation. So if you're selling products, generally, depending on a fiscal sponsor, the main question around selling something is sales tax, right? So depending on if the sales volume that you're talking about ends up being a large percentage of the organization's overall budget, then that might trigger the need to collect sales tax, to manage sales tax, etc. It also depends on what you sell. Some things are sales tax exempt, some things aren't. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice right now. But you can raise money, you can earn, you can sell things, all sorts of stuff. Nonprofit revenue generation is totally legal. Worst case, you pay some taxes on it. You think about like Goodwill, you think about 10,000 Villages. Those are all nonprofits, right? And all they do is sell stuff. So you can do it. It just means that the profits, the cash surplus you make from the organization doesn't leave the organization like profits would leave a for-profit company. When a for-profit company has profits, those profits can leave to the investors. And a nonprofit creates cash surpluses. We just can't call them profits, and they can't leave the organization. the best way to account for funds that go to an organization you're fiscally sponsoring so isn't counted as income. So this is asking if you're the fiscal sponsor. So you would count it as revenue for your organization. Like for example, the Urban Affairs Coalition right now we're managing, over $70 million for over 80 organizations. So that's all in one balance sheet. It all rolls up, and we manage it that way. Do you list professional services in your budget for the admin fees? Yes, you can. So usually the professional services are bundled under this called admin fees or indirect rate, and that covers the quote unquote overhead, which is what the admin fees cover. Usually you don't have to list them out by detail in a grant or budget application. Are fiscal sponsorships generally short term while the organization builds capacity, or is it sometimes benefit to stay for a long time? So I tend to think, and I'm biased, but that fiscal sponsorship is a better model, right? It's all about kind of collective economics. It's all about shared costs. So we're, like I said before, the example of UAC, we're a large organization. We're over $70 million under management. We're negotiating the price points for paper clips to cell phones to technology to everything down because we have that scale to do that. And we're able to bring those reduced prices to the programs that are under our umbrella. Some people see us as like an incubator. They want to get their feet wet. They want to start something and spin out, which is totally fine. It's really up to them. Some have left and come back, and some have stayed for decades. So it's really what you see your vision of doing, and if you want to take on the extra responsibilities of doing that, and looking at the cost to do that as well. Yep. So this next one from Evie Cruz from Philly VIP. Yes. If you like to consult with a lawyer about fiscal sponsorship, or you have an agreement reviewed, you definitely use them. We do talk to groups that have lawyers or have someone a lawyer on their board. So we've had that kind of level of conversation about what's going on. But I would definitely recommend that if you're going into with a new fiscal sponsor to have that. You just don't want to like be so excited to start that you just sign whatever is in front of you. You want to really review it, make sure you're comfortable with it. Most fiscal sponsors are willing to negotiate on some stuff, not everything, because there's legal reasons they can't, but sometimes they do. Do you ever consider nonprofits with subsidiaries to be managed under fiscal sponsorship? Broad strokes, yes. We're open, and most fiscal sponsors are open to just about every potential thing, as long as we can manage it. Some might be too big or complicated, but it's just a matter of looking at it, understanding it, and going ahead with it. And as long as everyone follows the rules, it doesn't matter if they have subsidiaries or not. Okay, any other questions?
I'm just going to jump in here for a minute. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to add them in the chat or unmute yourself. But I just want to reiterate some of the things that we talked about in last week's Is Starting a Nonprofit Right for You, and just kind of reinforce that, getting a fiscal sponsor doesn't mean you can skip the planning piece of your idea or your organization. So, just because you can find a fiscal sponsor, it doesn't mean that you can't think about what your mission is, what your values are, how you're going to market this, who's going to be a part of this, how are you going to fundraise? So keep that in mind, that this doesn't alleviate any of that planning process. And it's still a really important piece to being a successful organization or having a successful idea. So this is just one way to help you, reach your goals and achieve your mission, but it doesn't mean that you can't do any planning before going into this. I just want to add that in, building off of what we talked about in last week's class.
Yeah, the better plan we see that you bring to us, the more apt we would be to bring a group in faster. Oftentimes, there's a feedback loop where we'll kind of not quite Shark Tank somebody, but like get into the nitty gritty of the operations and the budget and really understand it, because usually it's a mission fit, right? Like you want to help people, we want to help people. It's not the mission, it's the operations, it's the risk profile. It's like, do you want to take kids camping? Do you want to teach kids how to use power tools? What's the risk profile that would have to be managed by the fiscal sponsor? There's a question about agreement types. I think, we do a full, what we call fiscal sponsorship agreements. There's no industry standard for fiscal sponsorship agreements, but if you go to fiscalsponsors.org, they talk about what you should expect in those. They might have a couple samples up on their site, or you can become a member and get those. But you want to have a good agreement that has a scope of services, expectations, exit clauses, intellectual property clauses, and risk and liability clauses. Anything else? All right, well, you can reach me I'll put my email in the chat if you want to reach out anymore. I'm happy to talk some more about this.